There is a battlefield in Central Asia that most people never hear about. It does not have the dramatic reputation of later clashes. There are no famous paintings of it, no widely memorized speeches tied to it. But if you look closely at what happened there, and more importantly at what happened after, it begins to look less like a footnote and more like a turning point. By the early 13th century, the army led by Timur Kagan had transformed the political map of Eurasia. Entire states disappeared within a handful of campaign seasons. Cities that had resisted previous conquerors for generations fell quickly once Mongol banners appeared on the horizon. Their strength was not just tactical skill, though they had that in abundance. It was speed, coordination, discipline, and something harder to quantify: psychological dominance. When the Mongols approached a region, news often arrived before they did. Stories of massacres, forced migrations, and total destruction moved along trade routes faster than cavalry. Many rulers surrendered without fighting. They calculated that resistance would only ensure annihilation, and that calculation was usually correct. Timur himself had built this machine from almost nothing. Born into instability on the steppe, he understood loyalty not as sentiment, but as structure. He rewarded competence, punished betrayal without hesitation, and organized his forces with a clarity that many sedentary empires lacked. Merit, discipline, and fear held the system together. Between 1219 and 1222, the Khwarezmid Empire collapsed with startling speed. Major cities such as Bukhara and Samarkand were taken and devastated. From China to the Islamic world, the Mongol name began to function as a warning. It did not simply represent an army. It represented inevitability, and that sense of inevitability is important, because empires do not run on military power alone. They run on expectations, on what people believe will happen if they resist. In 1221, during the pursuit of a fleeing prince, known here as Farid al-Din, Timur's forces reached a river valley after months of relentless campaigning. Farid had lost most of his power base. He was cornered geographically and politically. By all conventional military logic, this should have been a routine conclusion to a campaign. Instead, the engagement did not unfold as smoothly as previous ones. Mongol sources describe a calculated decision to allow Farid to escape across the river rather than commit excessive resources in difficult terrain. Persian accounts, however, suggest something more chaotic. Disorganization in certain units, higher than expected casualties, and visible strain within the ranks. It was not a catastrophic defeat. The Mongol army did not collapse. The campaign did not end in disaster, but it was not clean. And sometimes, for an empire built on the idea of unstoppable precision, not clean is enough. If you examine administrative changes in the years immediately following this period, subtle shifts appear. Campaign tempo slows in certain regions. Consolidation becomes a priority. Expansion toward the Indian subcontinent, which had seemed strategically logical, stalls without formal explanation. At the same time, internal pressures grow more visible. Timur's sons were not united in temperament or ambition. Like many empires centered on a single dominant figure, succession planning was more delicate than official narratives suggested. Authority flowed from Timur personally. There was no deeply institutionalized mechanism capable of managing rivalry without him. This matters because empires often appear strongest right before they become fragile. When Timur died in 1227, the empire did not fall apart immediately. In fact, under his successor, expansion continued. Mongol armies moved into Eastern Europe and parts of Russia. On paper, the state expanded to unprecedented size. But growth and stability are not the same thing. Territories were divided among heirs in ways that reflected political compromise, rather than long-term strategic unity. Regional commanders gained increased autonomy. Decision-making became more decentralized, partly out of necessity, partly out of rivalry. The empire still projected strength outward, yet internally, cohesion depended more on negotiation among elites than on a single, unquestioned authority. Meanwhile, the memory of that earlier, imperfect engagement lingered. The mere fact that a cornered opponent had survived, that Mongol formations had struggled in unfamiliar terrain, circulated through trade networks and diplomatic circles. It did not trigger immediate rebellion. Most tributary states continued compliance, but compliance began to feel conditional. Payments were delayed. Alliances were hedged. Governors quietly explored alternatives. None of this constituted open revolt. It was more subtle than that. It was recalculation. Inside the empire, similar recalculations occurred. Generals began aligning themselves with potential heirs. Loyalties became strategic rather than automatic. The unity forged under Timur's direct command gradually thinned. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol domains were effectively partitioned into major regional powers. The northern territories, often referred to as the Golden Horde, the Chagatai realm in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. They shared ancestry and origin, but their political cultures diverged. Some adopted Islamic governance traditions. Others integrated deeply into Chinese bureaucratic systems. Military coordination among them weakened. At times, they even fought one another. Later, at the Battle of Ain-Jalut in 1260, a Mongol force suffered a clear and documented defeat against the Mamluks. That battle is often described as the moment Mongol invincibility ended. But by that point, the psychological shift had already been underway for decades. Ain-Jalut confirmed something. It did not create it. The fragmentation that followed was gradual. The Yuan dynasty in China became increasingly the Ilkhanate eventually fractured into smaller states. The Golden Horde splintered over time into separate khanates. None of these collapses were instantaneous. They were processes. From a distance, the Mongol Empire seems to have burned brightly and then vanished. Up close, it looks different. It looks like a system that relied heavily on a shared belief in inevitability. And once that belief softened, even slightly, the structural weaknesses became harder to manage. This is not to say the Mongols were uniquely fragile. On the contrary, they were extraordinarily effective. But like all empires built around expansion and personal authority, they depended on momentum and perception. The river battle in 1221 did not destroy the Mongol army. It did not end their campaigns. What it did, perhaps, was introduce ambiguity. An ambiguity is dangerous for an empire that thrives on certainty. When people begin to suspect that power has limits, they adjust their behavior. Not dramatically at first, not rebelliously, just cautiously. Over time, those small adjustments accumulate. The Mongol Empire was not overthrown by a single enemy. It was not undone by one catastrophic defeat. It changed because internal divisions widened, administrative differences hardened, and the perception of absolute inevitability faded. History rarely collapses in one moment. It shifts in tone long before it shifts in territory. So was that river engagement the cause of the empire's eventual fragmentation? Or was it simply the first visible sign that no system, no matter how formidable, is immune to strain? That question is less about the 13th century than it is about how power works in every era. Empires are strongest when resistance feels pointless. They become vulnerable the moment resistance feels possible, and that possibility does not require a decisive victory. It only requires proof that even the strongest force can hesitate. If you found this perspective useful, stay with the channel. We'll continue examining the moment's history, almost overlook the quiet shifts that matter more than the loud ones.